agency in the chat, that'd be great. For today's meeting, Eric's going to start by giving us some quick highlights about the 2024 crash data and crash trends. Then we have some scoping to do for, we're kicking off a minor update to the Regional Vision Zero plan, and we need your input. Then we're going to hear a presentation from the City of Boulder on their citywide speed limit study, continuing our discussion about speed management strategies that local agencies in the region are using. Then I'm going to give a quick update on the Regional Vision Zero toolkit, some highlights on new safety literature, and then we'll wrap up with some news and updates. All right, with that, Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you if you're ready.
All right, so perfect. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. One moment. All right. Okay. Okay. Actually, let's just share the app. Okay, are folks able to see my screen?
Yep.
All right, great. Yeah, so thank you, Catherine. And just going to go over a couple of things that we've been looking at. I do want to note this is very short and is very preliminary. So please take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt, but we wanted to go ahead and preview a little bit of what we've been able to identify in this last year of data compared to 2023. First of all, I just wanted to start with this slide showing that, unfortunately, the total number of crashes in the Denver region is still slightly increasing. It was about a 1% or a little bit less than 1% or so change, but that's something to be aware of. This isn't normalized by population or vehicles mile travel. I did do sort of a normalization on my own for population, and the line is basically the same. So depending on how you're looking at it, that is still an upward trend. But onto some of the more pertinent information for our group. Unfortunately, this also means that the number of fatal crashes, which of course is a large emphasis for most of us, is still kind of an upward trend. There was a slight dip in 2023 in the region from 2022, and that has reversed, at least in this preliminary look at the data. Of course, sometimes these numbers, especially the numbers of fatal, can change compared to any others, depending on how investigations are going, what's going through at CDOT or FARS. So that may change, but wanted to again, kind of center us on this, that even though there's a lot of great work being done by everyone here, there's definitely still work to do. I wanted to look at some of the just different roadway users that are involved in crashes. One caveat too, before we go too far, is year to year is not the best metric to look at. I want to acknowledge that first and foremost, but just kind of how some of this data was in our system and also on our dashboard. For purposes of today, I wanted to look at last year's to today, or to 2024. So on the roadway users, this is kind of the people involved in the crash. And so oftentimes there's multiple different kinds of different users. You could have a bicycle and a pedestrian, or motorcyclist and a pedestrian, a motor vehicle. Almost all these are motor vehicle only. So it's over 2 times as many crashes involving just motor vehicles in collisions or in individual crashes. And interestingly, again, 1 year is not the greatest benchmark to look at for trends, but there has been a slight decrease in some of these categories. But we unfortunately do also see an increase. And we also are looking at a total of fatal and serious injury crashes lumped together, because sometimes the sample sizes can get small, which is a good thing if we have a small sample size to look at in reality, but for the data analysis, it makes it a little challenging. So we decided to look today at fatal and serious together. as a proportion of the types of crashes from these road users, again, acknowledging that year to year is not the best metric, but just wanting to show that it is very similar. There hasn't been a huge change, at least in our preliminary reading, between the types of crashes and individual or users that are involved in crashes. In the fatal category, there did seem to be quite an uptick in the motorcycle, and I think it's kind of what reflects this 3% change here between 2023 and 2024. So that's definitely something that we are going to be looking into and diving into those particular crashes a bit more to try to understand if there is a real trend there and how that might affect how we want to focus our work. One thing to highlight too is just among these 2024 fatal and serious injury crashes that we've gone through, we did consolidate some of the crash types. CDOT's data is really robust, and they spend a lot of time really figuring out what types of crashes are happening, what individual types of fixed objects might be being struck by motorists or motorcyclists or whoever is involved. But sometimes they make the percentages very small. So it's really useful for in-depth data analysis, but for a broader trend like this, we did combine some of those categories, those fixed objects. And so with that, looking at these are the top 5 crash types that are reflected in the 2024 data. We see pedestrian as the highest percentage tied with collision with object. And again, that's going to be guardrails, trees, electrical boxes, things that on their own might add up to 1% or 2%, but as a whole, kind of, we're in our view is kind of reflecting a broader trend of what's happening out there. Broadside crashes and an approach turn. I'm sure these are no surprise to most members of this group who attend regularly and in your own work. These can often be some of the most serious, as we're seeing, due to the forces involved, the speeds, the angles that are involved. And then rear end is showing up as well. Oftentimes this is thought of as not as severe of a crash type, and while there is a large number of rear end crashes that result in no injury or property damage only or suspected injury, they are still significant and something that warrants a lot of attention and concern on. That's basically what I have. Again, it's very preliminary. We received the 2024 data a few months ago from CDOT, but we finally got it through our geocoding and a lot of our processing. So we just had the chance to get into it very recently. But we will be publishing it on our regional data catalog shortly, probably within the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that, and we will also notify you all when that happens. We'll be updating the DRCOG crash data dashboard. This will include adding that 2024 data into it and cycling out the 2019. So we'll have 5 full years there to 2020 through 2024. This is going to be really great for analysis purposes because they're all going to be on the same schema for the first time, which I'm excited about, just to make our work a little bit easier, the important work that we're all doing. So keep an eye out for that, as well as some functionality changes that will be coming. And then really, which I think is going to be really kind of hopefully help us move the needle here, is what Catherine will be speaking about next, is we are embarking on a minor update to Taking Action and Regional Vision Zero. We spent a lot of time over the last 2 years, largely led by Emily Kleinfelter, now with Littleton, to update the action items of that plan. And one of those is to look at the data in it, the high energy network in it. And so we're not looking to change any of the implementation plan. We're still working through that. It's a really great, solid base for us to go off of. But we will be going through and updating the underlying data in there, as it is quite old. So we want to reflect the most accurate data we have and updates the high injury network. And so with that, I will turn it over to Catherine, who will be leading us through a little process to help us inform that.
Yeah, before we do that, does anybody have any questions or thoughts about the 2024 data? Okay, just wanted to give that opportunity.
Okay.
All right. Okay, can you see my screen okay, Eric?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so again, the emphasis for this is on minor update to taking action on Regional Vision Zero plan. So I was going to start by just giving I think everybody on here is pretty familiar with our plan, but just to give us a baseline for this discussion, it's our regional plan for improving transportation safety. It was adopted in 2020 and then updated in 2024 with new action items. It used 2013 to 2017 crash data for the Hindry network and for the crash profiles. So that's the focus of this update is getting those to be more recent crash data information. And then there was a 2024 Board of Directors resolution that formally established our target for Vision Zero of 0 traffic fatalities by 2040, 0 serious injuries by 2045. And so that's for the region. So the primary components of the regional safety plan, I just again wanted to refresh on this, is our regional Hindry network, which is the 9% of roads that account for 75% of fatal and serious injury crashes in the region. There are also critical corridors, so an extra level of prioritization on the Hindry network, and these account for, I believe, around like 50% of the highest injury roads, and there was also some public input, I think that our local stakeholder input that went into that as well. There are also regional crash profiles. So these are kind of like our region's version of crash types, but they were broken out by distinct area types. So for each of these area types, which are defined as urban, suburban, rural, and interstate, the sort of top factors were identified for each of these areas, and those became the regional crash profiles. So these are the conditions, the factors, et cetera, that account for the most fatal serious injury crashes. There are also countermeasures that were added in 2024 for each of the regional crash profiles, and then there are also action items and strategies for DRCOG. So I also wanted to talk about who it's used by and what it's used for. So the Regional Hindry Network is one of the key tools that DRCOG staff uses and DRCOG uses to prioritize projects for funding. So TIP funding, if we're looking at applying for a regional grant application, we really try to prioritize projects, at least for the safety criteria, using the Regional Hindry Network. That's not always the only factor, but it certainly is a key tool for us. And then action items are used to guide DRCOG's safety work. So for example, the Quick Build Toolkit was identified in the action items, since that's one of the key things that we're working on. I know that the plan is used by some cities and counties that lack their own safety plan. They can use the regional plan to apply for safe SS4A funding. And then I've also heard that it serves as a template or reference when local agencies are developing their own safety plans. Is there anything does anybody else use it for anything else? I think it's important for us to know this as we go through this process.
So this is a little wonky, but I use this type of data to advocate for network multimodal design use of right-of-way. When I engage across jurisdictions in Boulder County and flowing down from Boulder County's transportation master plan, I'll give one example. Highway 93 is contraindicated for safety. And I say, look, all these plans show this is a place for cars. So we need to find another place for bike ped use.
Yeah, I think that's a great use for it. Does anybody have anything else? Any other times when they turn to it? Okay, well, if you think of something, feel free to drop it in the chat. Your input is greatly appreciated. Okay, so the proposed scope for a minor update Again, we don't have consultant support for this. It's all being done in-house. And so our intent is to really focus on the data aspects of this. It's going to be pretty limited in terms of public engagement. So we're trying to keep it as objective as possible. And our goal is to update the Hindry network and the regional crash profiles with more recent crash data. We intend to use the 2020 to 2024 crash data now that we have the 2024 data. We also are looking at how can we be more proactive in identifying crash risks. And so what are the ways that we can do that? For example, can we add a risk-based network to the plan? And then finally, the other critical reason for doing this minor update is to add some of these quote unquote missing elements. So for example, things that might have been identified in USD DOT reviews for the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant opportunity, adding in that Vision Zero target, things like that. So our schedule, right now we are kicking off just the preliminary work of updating, of building out our kind of base framework for the Hindry network and crash profiles. And then we'll be working on doing a lot of this technical analysis through the spring. And then starting in the spring, beginning kind of the formal document development, and then public review over the summer is anticipated, and then hoping to get to adoption in the fall of 2026. We will be engaging this working group throughout this process on all of these updates, as well as doing periodic updates to our Transportation Advisory Committee, as well as the RTC, and then board updates as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunity, but again, our primary public input will be focused around this public review period, and it'll be really, again, about focused on the data updates and objective updates. So before I get to discussions, does anybody have any quick questions about any of that? Okay, so diving right in, this is the part where we need your input. We've done a lot of brainstorming on updating the Hindry network, and our GIS team got the amazing support of students at the University of Colorado, Denver, GIS students who did a review for us of what other regions are doing, what other cities are doing, and they created some amazing tools for us. But we've also been attending other local agencies, working groups for their safety plans and seeing what they're doing. And essentially, there's a lot of ways that people can develop their networks or networks that they use for prioritization. And so we wanted to consider what those are, were they feasible, did they make sense for us as a regional agency? So for example, I think the Colorado Department of Transportation is very focused on level of service of safety. So we considered, should we prioritize corridors using that rather than crash frequency, which is kind of the typical current Hindry network? Should we prioritize corridors using crash rate instead of crash frequency? And then should we take a more proactive, like risk-based approach, do like a high-risk network to prioritizing corridors? So I'm going to dive into each of these options that we considered and where we landed with each of them. So the first one about whether to use LOSS rather than crash frequency. So LOSS is a tool for essentially evaluating the safety performance of a roadway compared to, or intersection compared to other similar roadways and intersections. So it allows essentially the user to focus on corridors with the highest potential for crash reduction, the roads that it seems like there's the greatest opportunity for change. We decided to stick with the kind of more typical Hindry network. The primary, first of all, reason was the lack of data, as well as the lack of kind of statistical capacity to develop the safety performance functions and other tools that are needed to calculate the LOSS. We also just lack the really comprehensive data that's needed for analyses like that. We also considered that it could potentially reduce the focus on high injury roads if most of those roads have poor safety performance. So for example, major arterials, they tend to have more crashes. I think there's a situation in which it could lead to less of a focus on some of those arterials because they all generally have a higher crash rate. And so as a result, we might not be tackling specifically all the highest injury roads. I think the other big thing, though, as much as lack of data, is that it's fairly challenging to communicate to the public and elected officials. Just about what LOSS means. I personally wasn't as familiar with it, but before I moved to Colorado, it just wasn't used as much in Texas, and it took me a while to figure out what it was and why it's used. So not to say it can't be done, it's just a little bit more challenging. Next, we looked at whether to prioritize corridors using crash rate rather than crash frequency. So crash rate, if you're not familiar, is considering the volume of the road as well when factoring in the number of crashes, because higher volume roads tend to have more crashes. And so it's trying to sort of normalize based off of the volume of the road. We decided versus crash frequency is purely the number of crashes on a corridor, and then it's usually normalized based off of corridor length. So usually a number of crashes per mile or something similar. We decided to stick with crash frequency. First and foremost, the reason was, again, lack of data. We lack widespread, accurate traffic volume data on all of the regional roads. There are, big data tools and the regional travel model, but they're not always as accurate, I think, as we would like to be for something so sensitive as prioritizing where we want to make these big safety improvements. And then also too, this actually came from a recent CHRP report, which was while crash rate can facilitate comparisons between similar road types, kind of in a similar way that level of service of safety does. The region's goal is not to reduce fatalities per vehicle mile, but to reduce fatalities overall. So again, trying to align our methodology with our goal. And then we also considered whether to take a more proactive, risk-based approach to prioritizing corridors. Now, why do agencies do this? They do it because so they don't wait for a crash to occur to make safety improvements, especially when known risk factors exist along a corridor. So if you know that certain types of factors are commonly found in severe crashes and they're present along a corridor, and not waiting for those crashes to occur before you make safety improvements. So our decision here was to create a typical hydro network and risk-based networks for the region's top crash profiles. So there would probably be a pedestrian high-risk network. There will probably be kind of one of those top crash types that Eric listed, probably like a broadside or approach turn network. And the intent and the goal would be to help facilitate systemic projects. So allow agencies to see where if they where it could make sense for them to apply a bunch of like run off the road treatments, or at least look at whether those treatments are needed along that corridor to basically facilitate systemic projects. Now, this won't be as, we're still a little bit limited when it comes to data on this methodology. So we don't have ADT, but we do have, functional classification. So some of these measures that are usually used to determine risk will have to be substituted with others, which is why I think we want to keep both the typical hydro network and the risk-based networks. And so here's an example from Massachusetts DOT where they mapped high-risk roadways for example, lane departure crashes, and they had different levels of risk. Okay, so before we have a survey for you, but before we get to that, were there any questions or comments or thoughts about what I just presented? I know the folks on this call many of you have done your own safety action plans, and so I want to hear what you think so far. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Rolf.
Yeah, I'll help out here, jump on
Thank
it.
you.
No, really great presentation. I appreciate the kind of the pitching what you wanted to do and then kind of the rationale behind the decision. I think that makes a lot of sense and shows the thought that had been put into it. And in agreement, alignment, based on the reasons why you state, kind of lack of data and maybe there's a future where you have that data that can better help with those decisions, but at least acknowledging it really helps explain your case. The other thought that, we think of too, and maybe this is more of a tactic later on, might be looking at kind of the feasibility of prioritizing different roadways when you get there. For example, we look at East Colfax and, the level of investment in order to really change the way that roadway functions with the high engine network, is oftentimes a very high number. But that high number could be applied to other roadways and you could get a bigger, or I should say, change those other roadways more quickly. So again, more of a tactic when you get there, I think, and being able to remove some of those other kind of lower tier, if you will, roadways more quickly. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And that's why I do think that LOSS and is a great tool for like a secondary level of prioritization. Now that you've got your like highest injury roadways, then using that tool or another tool that might be out there to further prioritize feasibility. So great comments. What about anybody else? Do you agree with our rationale? Does all that make sense so far?
Yeah, I like it, and I like the focusing on frequency versus crash rate, because crash rate just seems not in the spirit of a Vision Zero program. That's saying that if vehicle miles are going up, we just expect to go further away from zero, and that's in terms of like mission and vision, it's better to use frequency, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I kind of wanted to, I guess, look at it a little bit from the opposite perspective. For those of you who I might have worked with in the past, I'm kind of a proponent for crash rate. I do agree and recognize the challenges of how do we have widespread data sources and volumes so that we can holistically like really introduce and generate crash rates accurately. But I guess where I'm cautious about solely or primarily looking at it through the lens of crash frequency, sometimes I feel like those areas where maybe we have intersections that are really susceptible to improvements get kind of washed by the wayside if they're not at our highest 25 or 10% of crash frequency intersections. I'm really interested kind of in the next few years, like as maybe alternative data sources become more available, not just maybe more traditional tube counts or radar counts, how we can do more citywide crash rate analysis and then find things. But even as an example, we've had some in the past I've worked on where a minor signal only had 4 crashes. Again, in the scheme of things, seems fairly insignificant. But when we compared the crash rate and saw that it was one of the worst intersections that we had seen as far as crash rate, and then diving in and doing a crash analysis, saw that all of the 4 crashes were front to side, not even front to rear. It kind of just raised the question of, are there benefits of crash rate that, again, maybe right now there's too many speed bumps in the way of really using it efficiently, but I think there's something to explore there in the future.
Absolutely. Emily.
Good morning. I was wondering, when it came to the risk network that you were doing, I know there's like the typical kind of factors that are going to be probably including, like right of way width and different infrastructure that's existing. But have we considered, I know the access to it is going to be challenging at a regional level, but access to more like the enforcement data? Because I guess I've been starting to think about when we are using crash data, it is still a reactive type of data. It's once the, behaviors that we're trying to prevent from happening are have occurred. And ideally, like an enforcement type of data is when hopefully a crash hasn't occurred, and more so they've like caught the behavior before it can lead to that crash. So even like red light running, that type of data, I'm just curious if there's any consideration of trying to get access to that and including it in that analysis.
Yeah, we could look at into that and think about that more. I guess, yeah, you're right in that the risk-based analysis does consider crash history in order to determine factors associated with risk. I think the only hesitation in my experience, but maybe people have had different experiences here, is that oftentimes enforcement is not oftentimes, but sometimes enforcement is not based off of hazards. When you have, council member requests, you get citizens requests, and we all know that that's not always representative of where the safety issues are. Would that be a concern?
I guess like maybe this is a ideal future one day when we've got more technology used enforcement, like with automated, cameras and red light running, that type of data that might be existing to see, again, we're kind of, do we have data that tells us people are making these making these decisions or having to, doing these bad behaviors before the crash has actually occurred? That's just what I'm curious to look into, and hopefully at the regional scale, we can maybe try and find some solutions.
Yeah, that's a great research question as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to what Thomas was saying about, like, is there benefits to crash rate? And I definitely think there are benefits. I think it's also would be beneficial as a second level of analysis to further call out where there are like anomalies going on. I think the risk with crash rate is that you discount it, kind of you almost get a benefit from having an increased volume. So suddenly there isn't as much of an incentive to target kind of high volume areas if the volume helps to cancel out some of those crash rates. So I think, or crash incidences. So I think that's sometimes where the issue to me can fall with the crash rate, but I do think it's a really it's still very beneficial to look at. Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I was just thinking about what Emily was saying, especially as it comes to the red light data, and I'm thinking maybe also automated speed enforcement. I think part of the recent legislation was mandating that local governments who are embarking on this expanded authority need to have some sort of public dashboard or display of data. So there might be a way we can try to tap into that, what's already being produced for that reason, but also thinking about near miss studies. If cities and counties have undertaken those, we are embarking on one actually this month with the city of Thornton as part of our innovative mobility set aside projects that we'll be looking at 10 intersections, and we're hoping to not only learn some things that can benefit the city at those 10 locations, but how those might be able to be lessons learned could apply to other intersections or other areas in the region. So we'll be trying to integrate some of that ideally into our analysis and how we approach things. But if anyone else has already done something like that, if they already have set up cameras or done any recordings, have learned anything, we'd certainly be interested to hear about that. So whether it's made it into an official Vision Zero action plan or not yet, if that can give us some ideas or where to maybe take the systemic analysis, please reach out, and I'd be happy to learn more about your work you've done.
Yeah, Stephen.
Hey everyone, thank you. Yeah, this is an interesting discussion about the methodology to use to prioritize corridors or hotspot locations. Arapahoe County right now is undertaking our safety action plan. And we're kind of doing a combination of all of the above of the things we've discussed here on this call, out of recognition, really, that I guess if you prioritize by crash rates or crash frequency, you do just kind of objectively get different kinds of locations bubble to the top of your prioritization. And so from my perspective, there's benefit to analyzing them both way. The goal is Vision Zero. We don't want crashes anywhere. And yeah, I do think it's very problematic that, that you get credit for, somehow having fewer fatalities or serious injuries on your roadway just because there's a lot of users of it. That's kind of incompatible with the goal of zero. But at the same time, when you do weight by volume, you do see areas, you do see like maybe specific intersections that pop out in a way that a lot of crashes don't. And so there's value to doing both. You'll get a different list of projects if you look at it both ways. And it's better in my mind always to have a longer list of potential projects. Funding is always scarce, and we're never going to be able to fund every single project we want to anyways. But having more options of what we can, of what would have value to do, and like looking at all those things both ways, probably at the end of the day just provides us more data for when we do prioritize. And so we're going to be trying to thread that needle of prioritizing based on, looking at these things with frequency and rates. And I guess we'll tell you in a little bit how that goes. But yeah, I guess it's an acknowledgement that it's complicated either way, right? We're missing something if we don't look at it in every way that we can. Is kind of the approach that we're taking. But yeah, I agree, and it's a big picture that the frequency is what we want to reduce. We want to get to zero. That kind of has to be primary, but we can't just stop there.
I appreciate that. I agree. And I think it'll be interesting. Maybe you can come back on and show the different maps that come out for frequency versus rate, so we can kind of see which ones come to the top in one map versus the other.
Yeah, we haven't really dived into the analysis yet in this safety plan. But I'm anticipating that will be the case, right? Because I'm looking at I've looked at our 2020 county local road safety plan, that it solely used the level of service of safety, like crash rate methodology, right? And I've also spent a lot of times, poking around on DRCOG's crash dashboard for our jurisdiction and familiarize myself with where our fatal and serious injury crashes are, and have some ideas of why a few of those locations may be more susceptible. And it's of course, we were implementing safety improvements in the areas that the 2020 study, based on crash rates suggested we do. We have implemented a lot of those since then, almost all of them, except for a few very expensive corridor projects. So that could be having an influence. But yeah, when I look at that 2020 study based on crash rates of here's a list of our priorities to go fix, and I look at like the most recent crash, data from the DRCOG dashboard, that is, basically looking just at frequency, how many dots pop up on the map. I am looking at different locations in the county. And I would expect that that's going to continue to a large extent when we do the detailed analysis. And so, yeah, I'm interested to kind of marry both at the same time, with the same set of data and see how they both fall out, like directly comparing them together. And I don't know how it will go yet, but yeah, I have strong hunches, but we'll see. Time will tell.
And I think from what it sounds like too, it could be good, in a kind of bigger future update to add in like an LSS or crash rate component, as well as just the crash frequency, just to provide an additional level of analysis. I think it's important though that we do get the Hydro Network updated sooner rather than later, because the data is quite old at this point. But I think this is good conversation to add for future discussion. So thank you for your feedback. So there are still a lot of details related to the Hydro Network that we haven't quite figured out, or we've had just discussions about internally that we would like your input on. So I'm going to go over to the Menti survey. And if you weren't able to log in yet, that's okay. I'm going to pull up the instructions once more. One second. Okay, here we go. All right, well, hopefully everybody's logged in now. I'm going to keep going. So our first question that we've been playing around with is, should limited access highways be included in the regional highway network? Yes, no, should they be analyzed separately? So by limited access, I mean anything that requires an on-off ramp to get onto. So things like usually interstates, but there are also some state highways as well. And so I wanted to first kind of give you a little bit of kinds of reasons that we've thought about why it could make sense and reasons why it might not make sense. So I think reasons for including, they are included in the current Hindry network, and interstate highways are part of a big part of the regional roadway network. Now, reasons why we might not want to include. The first one is they aren't typically included in regional or local Hindry networks. That was one of the findings, particularly the regional side, by the University of Colorado students. Another one is that they can, quote unquote, suck up, for lack of a better word, a lot of the roadway mileage in Hindry networks. So when we think about how we use our regional Hindry network, it's primarily used to prioritize, to help us prioritize projects and improvements. And it's based off of, a certain percent of mileage. Well, if a good, I think today, 17% of that mileage is limited access highways, that could be 17% that goes towards non-limited access highway roads. And this kind of goes to the second point as well, is that the regional Hindry network is really used to prioritize limited access highways for funding and improvement. Usually they tend to typically be funded with state funding. That's not to say there aren't sometimes they come through the TIP process, but usually CDOT has their own process and prioritization process for prioritizing improvements on these limited access highways. So reasons for, reasons against. I'm going to get to the survey question. And feel free to also ask questions or give comments as we go through this. So yeah, the first option is yes, they should be included. Second option is no, they should not be included, or maybe analyzed separately if CDOT has a need. And another is other, just if you need an out, if you don't know. Okay, for those that said yes, would you be willing to share your reason for why you think they should be on the regional Hindry network?
Hey, this is Stephen in Arapahoe County again. I did vote yes. For our county specific safety action plan I just referred to a few moments ago, we are excluding high limited access highways, specifically because we don't own those roads. We know that CDOT does it. That's, that is CDOT's role. But we also do know that there's a lot of crashes on those. Like if you look at our crash data board, just like there's something going on. Like there's stretches of I-70 out in eastern Arapahoe County, for instance, that have a lot of crashes. And so I know we're not looking at it because it's not our road. We don't own it. We're not controlling it. We're not going to put local money onto fixing mainline I-70. But at the same time, if we don't do it, who is looking at it, right? And so, I guess maybe I could be convinced to become a no vote if I knew more about what CDOT's process is for how they are looking at these and how they are prioritizing them. If there's a statewide, looking just at the interstates, kind of Vision Zero plan, similar to what Dr. Cog is undertaking for the region. Maybe that would make me more comfortable, but I'm a little bit afraid that, there's fatalities here. There are people dying on these highways. Who's going to look at it? I know the locals are not, so it seems like a regional thing. People use these roads as, to get from one place to the region to another, primarily, right? We call them interstate highways, but I think we know that most of the traffic, on I-25 through Denver is just getting from one part of Denver to another. It seems like a regional issue.
Sanjeev, I think you had your hand up. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think Stephen has a very good point and summed it up well. My reason was a little less connected, but I wanted to include them because I feel like what's going on those limited access highways directly impacts the access points. So when the I-70 or US6 or I-225 is backed up, all the on ramps are backed up, and that affects local roads. So the crashes, it is more convenient to divide them based on roles and responsibilities, but I think that's kind of why we have a organization like Dr. Cog to separate some of those jurisdictional or ownership or maintenance concerns and really look at the whole picture.
Michelle.
Thanks, Catherine. Just what I hope is a quick question, and I apologize if I missed it earlier. Is Dr.Cog intending to pick the regional high injury network based off of traffic counts? So is it going to be like a weighted by count? Because I think that would actually change this conversation. Is there any?
No, it will not factor in traffic volumes.
Okay, because I think if that would be where I would want to have this included, is if that was ever something that we could do as a region, then I think it would be important to look at this and see kind of how they compare. Like, should we be focusing on them? Because even though they carry significantly more traffic than all, the other roadways, is that rate just so much higher, if even accounting for the fact that the volume, like, is it per 1,000 cars a day? Is it that much bigger of an issue on the limited access highways versus the local roadways? And I'm guessing the answer is no, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Did anybody else from CDOT have any strong opinions about this? I'm thinking it might be beneficial for us to develop networks in both ways, just to show at the next meeting, one that includes the limited access highways, and then one that doesn't. I anticipate the next meeting will be showing several different different high injury networks, and so that could be one of them. So we can continue this discussion. Okay, I'm gonna get on to the next question because we still got a few, and we still have to hear from City of Boulder. Okay, so another idea that we had was, should minor injury crashes be used in addition to fatal and serious injury crashes to create the regional high injury network? So reasons for is that, as Eric mentioned, fatal and serious crashes are pretty random events and have a somewhat fairly low sample size. And so adding additional data points could better indicate trends. Reasons against, it would be different and inconsistent from most high injury networks. That's not necessarily a fatal flaw, just something to note. If we wanted to add weighting based off of crash severity, it would make the high injury network harder to explain, like why those corridors were selected to be on it. It wouldn't give us it might not. I guess we could still have a stat, but it just about number of fatal serious crashes in X percent of roads, but it just would add a little bit more challenge. And then it could change the focus of the regional crash profiles unless we kept those just still focused on fatal and serious crashes, because minor injury crashes, they're more likely to be, side swipes, rear ends than fatal and serious crashes. So it could change what we focus on for the regional crash profiles unless we kept them separate. So again, it's going to be a yes, no, and other. You just aren't sure. So should minor injury crashes be used in addition to fatal and serious injury crashes to create the regional high injury network? Okay, I think based off of this, we probably won't end up including them. It was just an idea, but I think that's where we might end up leading, is not including them. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, no, it sounds fine to me.
Okay. Anybody have any strong opinions about this that they want to share before we move on? Yeah, Michelle.
If you guys do anything with the bike ped specific maps, I would advocate pretty heavily to include them. Whereas I would be less strongly opinionated if it's just vehicles.
That's a good point. Like maybe we could add them in for some of the high risk networks.
Yeah, or like potentially, I don't know if it would probably mess up the data, but if you could include minor injury by like the more vulnerable, like somehow including vulnerable road user crashes, period. Just throwing out some ideas.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, I'm just echoing what Michelle said. I agree, right? Like if we're looking at bike ped or vulnerable road user crashes, a minor injury crash should be considered as well.
I don't know if you can change your vote, but if you can, I wonder if that would be a good other voting option is, should we include minor injury for only vulnerable road users?
I think you guys can open it back up.
Oh, maybe if I go back. Do others agree with that?
The Mentimeter says that we've already answered the question. So
yeah.
But yes, I agree. Adding vulnerable users as a category and including them.
Okay.
I have a quick question to throw in. Sometimes when we talk about vulnerable road users, we just mean like bike, ped, scooter, that type of, or personal implement, because that's what the CDOT definition is on their reports. But we also have considered more directly in our plan and on our dashboard in recent years, the motorcyclists, as it's kind of obviously there's not the protection that can be afforded occupants of a full motor vehicle, and the rates are so much higher for the usage of a motorcyclist as a percentage of travelers versus the fatal and serious injury. So what are thoughts in including those crash types, or is that straying a bit from what the intention is with vulnerable road users? Of course, not saying it's unimportant and still looking at it, but for the purpose of this, when you say vulnerable road user, would we be wanting to include that user category?
I'm seeing some likes in the chat.
Okay, great.
Yeah, feel free to add that in the chat. Rolf?
Yeah, I was gonna just bring up how oftentimes bicycle and pedestrian crashes are underreported. They'll show up to the ER to get attention. So just a bit of an asterisk there. And that also may be, like a secondary tactic or something to look into or consider, diving into the ER data to get a better picture of those types of crashes. Just, you know, flagging that if you're counting the KSI, most likely they'll have a police report that you can pull. But if you're looking for all bike ped crashes, you might be missing quite a few of those. Just something to consider. Thanks.
That's a great point. Eric, I sent some follow-up meetings with state folks in our future about how we can look at that. Michelle.
Just a quick thing on the motorcycle crashes. I would have no problem with those being included. Eric, the reason I think that the ped and bike collisions also go pretty unreported in terms of injury. I don't know how much of a thing that is for the motorcyclists collisions, so I'm not sure if that would swing things significantly one way or the other, where in the bike ped realm I do, but I would have no problem with them being included.
Okay, awesome. If you have any other thoughts, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to keep us moving. We have 2 more of these survey questions, and then we'll be done with it. Is it beneficial to have a further level of prioritization in the form of critical corridors? So I think reasons for is those of you who might already have your own Hydra networks, it's still a ton of roadway mileage. And so it can add a second level of prioritization if you want to see what are the top of the top. It could be used to provide like some equalization across counties, depending on what methodology we use for critical corridors. I think reasons against, originally I was just like, is it just another thing that could clutter the plan that people don't really use? Or that was the best I could come up with for why not to, but, and then unlike the current plan that used local input to select the critical corridors, we would be really just basing it off of data. And so there are a couple of different ways that we could do it that we could discuss at a future working group meeting. But one way is like we could use it as a way to kind of quote unquote identify projects. If we remove corridors that already have funding, it could signify like what are top corridors without funding for the future, or it could just be purely based off of the data, or we could add an equity consideration. So anyways, all right, so the question is it still beneficial to have this further level of prioritization in the form of critical corridors? Yes, no, unsure. Okay, so I think this one's yes, but we probably will need to continue to discuss the methodology more at a future meeting. All right, 5 more seconds. Okay, last question. Should there be any effort to equally distribute or more equally distribute the Hydra network across the region? Reasons for, so this was actually one of the things identified by the University of Colorado students that other regions do, but there are reasons for and against. So I think reasons for, this would be a reason for said less dense cities and counties, they would have more roads on the regional Hydra network. It could also make it more useful for cities and counties that don't already have their own plan. And I kind of get the sense that that's why other regions have done it. So we would basically be creating essentially a Hydra network for each county, more or less. And so then it might make more sense for local agencies to use the regional plan as their own if it has a more, comprehensive, widespread network for them to use versus if they only have a couple corridors on it. Reasons against, it may be counter to the regional goal of 0 fatalities. So because we would be doing it by county, the Hydra network might not actually represent the highest injury roads across the region. It would just be the highest injury by county. So as a result, we could be using it to prioritize funding for roads that are not actually the highest injury across the region. An example methodology, again, could just be something like the top 10% of highest injury roads in each county, or could be discussed further. Okay, Emily, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, thank you. From what I understand, this is what the critical corridors are, is that it was a like creation of trying to distribute the high energy network across all of the counties and like equally. And so this was that like it sort of was like the critical corridors are the top 10% corridors within sort of each local area. So I guess I'm just kind of confused on the difference of the two questions.
Yeah, so one lesson learned is make sure your consultants detail everything, because unfortunately some methodologies are missing from the original plan. In the plan, it states it's the top 50% of high energy network corridors, but I don't think it's, and it might be by county, the critical corridors, and it might be by county, but then there's also opportunity for input. So it's not clear, but I think that's another point, that the critical corridors could be used as an alternative way to kind of equally distribute or highlight priorities in each of the counties.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, Michelle.
To me, this question seems almost the opposite of the last question, and I'm not sure if that's how it's intended. But I would assume that if you do it just based on numbers of crashes without looking at volume, then Denver's right, like any metro area is going to pop like nobody's business, and everything else outside is going to be. So I guess I have no idea. It's a little hard to answer the question just based off of this. So do you guys know generally what are you going to do both together?
Like the critical corridors and the hydrant. So Eric and I actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to word these two, because they can kind of, it could be the hydrant network, it could be the critical corridors, it could be neither, that you try to add in some distribution. I guess it's just a matter of, do folks think there should be any sort of distribution? And I think starting with the question at the regional hydrant network level, and then we can if that being a yes or no, and then we can talk about the critical corridors separately. And but I think the first question about critical corridors is like, do we want to even have a conversation about critical corridors in the future?
And one thing, just before we hop up to Marnie, one thing that we've also talked about is doing something similar to what City and County of Denver did with their most recent Vision Zero plan, where the central, I think it was like 4 or 5 statistical neighborhoods in the downtown area were excluded for that reason. And Rolf could correct me if I'm wrong about how that's being done, because obviously the city and county is still working in that area and is still applying safety treatments and working on it. But even that plan recognized that it may have distorted some of the other networks if it was included. So we've explored some ideas like that, but we haven't settled on that or not.
Marnie?
So my question is, have you polled all of the communities in DRCOG's region, and to what degree are there gaps at the county level that DRCOG needs to do that analysis? You know, Boulder County has done a Vision Zero plan. Adams County's working on one. Jefferson County's working on one. So I guess I have another question around that, which is, how do those, do the local community or county level plans interact, or how does the analysis you're doing consider those plans in the analysis?
Great question.
So those are the two questions that would help me better answer whether to prioritize roads at the county level. It just seems a little duplicative and not necessarily the regional effort.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. At this point, I think most counties have a plan or are in the process of developing a plan. I think doing it at the county level could have made sense if we had done it 4 years ago. I don't know that it makes as much sense or provides as much value to today. In terms of how it relates to those plans, it at a data level, it's fairly separate. I think it can, like, the regional plan can be used by local agencies as like as an additional level of justification for why something might be a priority. I also think it'll be beneficial when we are, put out the draft Hindry Network for review, if you compare it to your local plan and see roads that are high injury and want to flag something for us to investigate further about why a road might not have shown up on the regional Hindry Network that you think should. Okay, I think we're gonna probably end up continuing to prioritize it at the regional level. Does anybody have any strong opinions or want to say anything about, add any other reasons why you would like it at the county level? Okay, all right, so I've gone way over my time. Now I'm going to be handing it over. That concludes our discussion today about the minor update to the Regional Vision Zero plan. We're going to be turning it back over to our presentations, and I'm going to be handing it over to Devin Jocelyn with City of Boulder to talk about their speed management study. Devin, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And just to do a time check, I mean, how much time would you like me to spend? Like 10 minutes or so, or?
You got yourself muted, Catherine.
Thanks. Yeah, feel free to take 10, 15 minutes, however you need, and then we can do a little bit of Q&A and then wrap up the meeting.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks so much for the invite to talk today about this methodology that Boulder has prepared. That's a context-sensitive methodology for setting speed limits. This was a methodology that we finalized kind of in the summer of last year, and we've completed the first phase of implementation, and we're currently in the process of working on the second phase of implementation. But I'll give a quick overview of the process and some of the background behind why we chose to go this route with our speed limit setting approach. So this is kind of what I'll be talking about, just overview of the methodology, why we did it. I'll give some examples, show the results, and then talk about some of the key takeaways. Boulder, we changed our default speed limit on local streets in 2020 to 20 miles an hour unless otherwise posted. As part of that effort, any local streets that were signed at 25 were also changed to 20 miles per hour signed. But we knew from our crash data from the 2018 through 2020 period that 1 in 3 severe crashes involve speeding. And we also knew that there might have been some inconsistent speed limits on our collectors and arterials. We had heard feedback that certain people, as they're traveling around the city, they said, "Hey, I'm staying on the same street, but the speed limit changes like 3 or 4 times, and why is that?" And we were getting feedback like that kind of wanted us to take a closer look at how speed limits were set across the system and ensure that we had a consistent methodology. We also knew at that time that there were some context-sensitive methodologies that had already been developed. CDOT was in the process of developing their new speed limit setting methodology. And as a result of all that, we packaged that together and some of this logic that I talked about and pursued a DRCOG Community Mobility Planning and Implementation grant. And that is what funded this study. We were awarded $125,000 to do this work. And we involved both internal and external stakeholders. Some of the internal stakeholders were obviously some of our other city departments, like our city attorney's office, city manager, communications, fire, police. And then we also worked closely with CDOT and Boulder County. And then our kind of external representatives include a Transportation Advisory Board member, Community Cycles, Center for People with Disabilities, and Boulder Transportation Connections. I talked a little bit about the purpose already, but It's summarized here. You know, essentially, we knew that as part of the safe system approach that safe speeds are part of that. And we wanted to have a very data-driven approach to setting speeds and also consider bicycle and pedestrian activity. So in terms of the methodology, this is kind of how it played out and was analyzed as part of our development process. You know, like I mentioned, we knew there were tools out there that had either been developed or were in the process of being developed, such as US Limits 2, some NCHRP resources, and the CDOT methodology that was being developed at the time. We also had conversations with 6 peer cities, which included Austin, Charlotte, Madison, Seattle, Davis, California, and Denver. This project ended up being our largest single data collection effort in the city's history. We collected traffic volume and speed data at over 240 locations throughout the city. And those data collection locations corresponded to the various segmentation that we developed along the collector and arterial streets. You know, from there, we worked into, well, what factors should be considered as part of our context for the roadway. And we, you know, looked at what we had available in GIS form that was readily accessible and could be easily mapped and overlaid and, you know, analyzed to give us kind of a point-based system for looking at how we would set speeds. You'll see later on that we developed both a speed limit range and output tables. And then we, you know, really wanted to look at kind of establishing an implementation plan over time that corresponded to our ability to do this with our staff capacity. I think I talked a lot about this already. The key thing to note there is that it was kind of this half-mile segmentation that was developed. And that basically resulted in those, you know, approximately 240 segments, and each individual segment was then put through this methodology to develop a recommended speed limit. The attributes that were considered included land use, and this, you know, map kind of shows how the land use looks within Boulder. We, you know, took some liberty simplifying certain land use categories, and that's why you'll see so much residential mixed use zoning districts, is those were kind of combined and consolidated across the many zoning categories within the city. This shows the different 16 factors that we ended up selecting for the roadway context and the weighting associated with each. Crashes ended up being 35% of the weighting. Multimodal considerations, such as, you know, the number of crossings, the level of pedestrian and bike activity, and the type or lack of pedestrian or bike facility on the roadway, that accounted for 35% also. And then just kind of the way the roadway is configured, attributed for about a quarter of the weighting. And that had to do with things like the driveway density, the presence or absence of on-street parking, the number of through lanes, and then just the overall intersection density, whether unsignalized or signalized. And finally, we looked at kind of the proximity of a roadway segment to a school, park, or assisted living facility. And if a roadway segment was within a quarter mile of one of those things, it got 2 points respectively for each of those factors. So we put that all together and developed kind of this map that's shown here with 3 different tiers of the points assigned across the roadway system. And Boulder does have a high-risk network that we developed as part of our Vision Zero action plan. And those roadways are what you see in the yellow highlight. And those roadways we decided to treat a bit differently in the methodology, which I'll show in these next few slides. So these next 5 slides or so walk through the kind of the flow chart that was developed and the process for applying and using the methodology to determine a recommended speed limit. And the first question we asked is it part of the high-risk network? And if the roadway segment was, we wanted to look at developing a recommended speed limit based on the rounded down 50th percentile speed. And that's essentially the most conservative or lowest speed, that you would get from looking at the speed data along a roadway segment. The next thing was to look at, if it wasn't on the high-risk network, what tier of roadway was it? And then that tier would correspond to this output table that would tell you how to round the speed to get a recommended speed limit. This is just a closer up view of that table. And you can see each of the 4 rounding, I guess, rounding percentiles we used. So we had a rounded down 50th, a closest 50th, rounded down 85th, and a closest 85th. And then, the final or the 4th layer was to then say, okay, we've done all that, we've rounded the speed, and then how does that rounded speed fall within what we're calling a range of speed limits for the various, land uses and classifications within the city. And that was defined in our speed limit table. And so you can see we're kind of setting lower and upper speed limit bounds based on the different land use and classification. So if it fell, below the range, the idea was that we would use the lower bound of the range. If it was within the range, the recommendation was to go with the recommended rounded speed. If the recommended rounded speed, fell above the upper bound of the range, then the recommended speed was set at the upper bound of the range. This is just a closer view of that speed limit table. And, within here, there's also the breakdown of the different miles and percentages of the streets that fall into each of those categories. And the final layer was to, apply some engineering judgment to just validate and refine the results. There were some instances where the methodology, like I alluded to earlier, maybe along a certain, say, mile or 2 mile segment of a roadway that really doesn't change all that much. There might have been like 3 different speed limits recommended by the methodology. So it seemed a little impractical to have, these limits changing along what's really such a short overall segment of roadway that doesn't change too much in character. So here's some examples that I'll run through very briefly. The first one is Arapahoe Avenue from 17th Street to Folsom Street. You can see the speed data there. Collected was an average 85th percentile speed along that segment of 33. The 50th percentile was an average of 28 miles an hour. This scored as a tier 1 segment, but it also happened to be on our high-risk network. So that kicked it into the rounded down 50th percentile speed. Existing speed is 30. Those were the 3 locations where we collected speed data shown on the map with the dots and the corresponding 50th percentile speeds, which averaged out to 28. And when we use the rounded down approach to that rounds down to 25. So this segment came away with a recommendation of 25 miles an hour because that was within the speed range for that type of roadway. A minor arterial can range from 20 to 35. And since the recommended rounded down 50th percentile speed fell within that range, that was the recommended speed for that roadway. The second one is showing how the methodology applies to kind of an industrial, agricultural minor arterial roadway. And this is 55th Street, kind of on the east side of town between Flatiron Parkway and Arapahoe Avenue. Speed data is shown there. This one happened to score out as a tier 3 roadway, which, kind of is shown here. That's how the points were assigned to get the tier 3 ranking. Because this is a, industrial agricultural and a tier 3, it has a little bit less conservative rounding, if you will. So it was to go with the closest 85th percentile speed. Which happened to be 45 in this case, but we were saying, based on the speed limit table, that we don't want a minor arterial within the city to be faster than 40. So that essentially meant the recommended speed was to make no change and keep it at 40. The results, this is kind of the summary of how it all shook out when we applied it across the city. Essentially, as you might expect, with the speed limit table and just the overall character of the streets near downtown, that's where the lower speeds were recommended. And our highest speeds were recommended, kind of on the outskirts of town, if you will, in some of our less developed and more industrial or agricultural areas. We did find that about 73% of the evaluated streets were recommended to be set at 30 miles an hour or less, and only 12% were recommended to be set at 40 or higher. So that was interesting. And then, overall, it found that maybe, say, 60% of the streets that no change was recommended. And then of the streets that had a recommended change, almost 90% of those were recommended to just be reduced by 5 miles an hour. And then none of the high-risk network streets were recommended to be increased. And, almost 2/3 of the high-risk network streets were recommended to be reduced slightly. I think some of the successes are summarized here. Again, this was a project that we were able to have a successful grant application for and use grant funding to complete. And then it really was the first ever systematic citywide evaluation of speed limits that had been done in Boulder. And it involved the largest data collection effort ever citywide, as I mentioned. And then, the map shows essentially all the dots and the locations across the city where we collected data. And, in the end, we came away with what we think is an innovative methodology that really incorporates roadway context and industry best practices. And this methodology, matches our goals for safer speeds, and we think will help us get closer to Vision Zero. And then it kind of came away that most of what we had already been doing in the past was okay. 60% of the roadways came out with a recommendation for no change. And then we think that the method really recommends slower speeds where it matters most, which is helpful, I think, in building trust with the community and just protecting those vulnerable roadway users. So that's it for the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions with the time we've got left. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. Amazing food for thought, and so much work was done. So thank you. Does anybody have questions? I can kick it off really fast. What was the coordination with law enforcement on, for example, was there a period of issuing warnings when limits were changed, or was anything to note about law enforcement coordination?
Not really. I mean, in terms of the change process, we basically tried to package together a series of roadways where we knew we wanted to prioritize the changes, and we combined all that into like a public notice that we issued and posted on the website, and then we basically just went and changed the speed limits.
Emily,
And
go
I
ahead.
do think another lesson learned is to try to get to the bottom of how Google Maps advises people what the speed limit is. I think it's tied to their Street View imagery. And so many of these roadways where we've changed the speed limit, Google still tells you, it's the old limit if you look at Google Maps.
Yeah, Emily.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm talking so much, but we are definitely looking at doing this in Littleton in the future. So one, Devin, I would love to just get any materials you have. If you're able to share those after this meeting with the whole group, that would be wonderful. But how has been the sort of public and political pushback or support for this as it's been not just implemented, but even kind of, was there political support from leadership and city council and that kind of within your partners to get this all put in place, or were you kind of having to pull people along the way?
I think we were fortunate in that I would say we did have political support to do this. And, at least with the streets that we started, which I would say are some of the lower hanging fruit, I mean, they were streets that really didn't have signalized intersections, so they were pretty straightforward to just go and change. I think we've heard almost nothing, dare I, knock on wood. And this has been almost, a year now since we've done kind of that first round of changes on the roadways. And I don't think we've gotten much public pushback.
Michelle.
Yeah. And thanks, Jocelyn or Devin, for sending this out or sharing this. It looks like you're setting speed limits pretty far below the 50th percentile. And I'm sure this is old school, but I've always done the reasonable and prudent thing. So you can't set any laws where a majority of the people are going to be breaking that, basically. And so I guess what kind of thought did you put into that, or clearance did you get from attorneys, or can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to say we're setting them below the 50th is probably not fully correct, because I think in any case if you were going with a rounded down 50th, there could be instances where the recommended speed was lower than the 50th. But we had that variation within the output table, I guess it was called, where, we would look at either the 85th or 50th, depending on the roadway context. So I think that was the kind of the justification for how we landed on that approach.
Okay, sorry, can I ask a quick follow-up? So the one, I think, and maybe it was just the one example that you showed, had your 50th at 28 or 29, and then setting it at 25, I would assume based on a normal, where a large majority of your pace, your 10 mile, that data was within the pace, you're probably looking at 25% of people going actually below that already. So yeah, I guess I'd be curious, the rounded down 50%. Yeah, that would.
Yeah, I can't remember specifically I feel like we were drawing on some resources or just the conversations we had had with peer agencies, that's how we ended up with those 4, different categories, and even considered kind of going with a rounded down 50th. as one of our rounding methodologies.
I
Okay,
wonder if
thanks.
the justification maybe came from the crash history, because that was like you only consider that correct if it was like.
Yeah, I mean it was only used, I guess, in few instances, right? And it was kind of if it had gotten to that tier 1, as the roadway factors were telling you, it had a high need for low speeds. Those are the categories of roadways where we applied that rounding methodology. But there still could have been instances where if we applied that methodology, the speed may have fallen, below the range of speeds for a roadway type, in which case it would have either kind of remained constant or been like rounded back up, if that makes sense.
All right. Thank you so much, Devin. I really appreciate you giving this presentation. And yeah, if you could send it my way, I'll get it out to the rest of the working group. You mentioned about CDOT developing their own speed limit setting guidance. I don't think I've seen it online yet, but when it's done and out there for the public, I'll be hoping to invite those folks to present on that new statewide guidance as well, just to provide a menu of options and different perspectives. So I'm just going to run through our couple final slides. If you can bear with me for 5 more minutes. I just wanted to give a quick update on the Regional Vision Zero Quick Build Toolkit. Just like 2 slides. So it's going to be a kit of parts. So basically a series of separate deliverables, but there'll be ones on sort of a menu of safety treatments and improvement types that are quick build, quick win. Then another part on materials and public art considerations, as well as maintenance, weather, things like that. General lessons learned about why some communities seem to be doing more, the kind of different processes that agencies might follow to implement quick build processes, an example image library, because with a lot of these materials, there are a bunch of different things you can do with them, different treatments you can create with them. A before and after evaluation template, because a lot of times quick build is being installed as a demonstration or pilot. And so what are metrics that are commonly used? And then whatever standard detail examples that we can get our hands on that we can share, so sort of templates. The ways that you can help. So send me pictures of any quick build improvements that you might have in your community. I'm really looking for a range of urban, suburban, rural settings. And so what I really mean is just any type of treatment that isn't concrete or is kind of a like creative, low cost retrofit. So if you have any examples of that you already have, please send them my way. If you have any opinions on materials that have worked well and that haven't worked well, so for example, paint, pavement markings, flex posts, rubber curbs, anything else. If there's some that you've developed an opinion on, I would love to know. Also, if anybody has done any sort of public art installations, I'm still looking for additional insight about the paint that's used for those, particularly if it's easy to use, low cost, things like that. And then also we're going to be sending out documents kind of as they are developed. So if you can review and provide comments on those, it'll make it just a more valuable resource for everybody. They won't be, when I send them out to this group, they won't be the pretty version. So just forewarned, they won't be, graphic designed yet. But we want your input, so then there'll be less editing for our graphics team on the back end. And then I just wanted to point you to a couple new pieces of safety literature. Oh, my order got out of whack. Sorry about that. One of them is this new NCHRP report about a guide to applying the safe system approach to transportation planning, design, and operations. And it's sort of a self-assessment that agencies can take to better understand where they're at on the safe systems journey. They kind of put it as you're working to incorporate, on one end of the spectrum, you're working to incorporate more proven safety countermeasures into your work. And then on the other end, you are creating roadways and tire systems that completely preclude the likelihood of a fatal or serious injury, crash from occurring at all. And then it kind of breaks it down into 5 or 6 of these different realms. So policy, planning, design, operations, law enforcement, post-crash response. There is a self-assessment tool that I would recommend everybody check out in Appendix G. It's pretty much just like a checklist of, and you assign yourself a score from like 1 to 4. That I think it might be beneficial to work on, with other managers in your agency, and just giving copies of the introduction and the kind of specific chapters to the relevant managers and leadership kind of helps explain the SAFE system, as well as gives ideas about how your agency could incorporate it more in the future. And so a couple of highlights that I found was, with policy, just really focusing on proactive safety improvements that focus kind of at a population level, rather than policies that really require a lot on the effort of individual road users to be safe. With planning, a couple of the interesting ideas I read was, one of them simulating the safety effects of long-range plans. So are you planning for a safely built out city or future future city, or could there be any negative consequences of any of the planned growth or plan improvements? Clearly defining the functionality of roads, so access function or mobility movement function. Aligning your land use and roadway purposes, so avoid having destinations on, especially pedestrian destinations, on fast, busy arterial streets. And so that kind of goes back to your land use plans, as well as looking at your roadway plans and aligning them, and also talks about access management. And then there was the idea of replacing travel forecasting, so where you're kind of predicting and then trying to meet that prediction with what are you starting with a vision instead, and then how do you get to that vision? So just different ideas, I think, was my takeaway from this document about how safe systems can be incorporated in different ways. I think with design, it just talks about, in a safe system, road user safety is the foundation of design decisions rather than officially moving cars. And some of the key things to focus on include instituting self-enforcing roadways, designing around human tolerances, and physically separating fast-moving vehicles, not only from each other, but also from vulnerable road users. Operations and maintenance. I think this was also one of the most interesting chapters to me, because it really reinforces that you have to, if you don't maintain your safety improvements, they're not going to stay safe, as well as the impact that, pavement surfaces and other things can have on safety. And so having, for example, a really robust asset inventory and then managing those assets. When you do implement new roadway safety elements, having design standards and maintenance plans for them, and just a few other ideas that I found interesting. And then law enforcement. So some ideas were observing and documenting risk patterns with engineers, collaboratively investigating serious crashes. So an example of that would be like a rapid response team. Again, because officers might see things on a day-to-day basis, out in the field that might not show up in the data, as well as, bringing in, community partners, like if there's, the housing authority might be relevant, or, any sort of civic groups. Of course, accurate and thorough crash reporting, talks about the benefits of automated enforcement, and then some interesting kind of ideas for the state and courts from a legal perspective. And then post-crash response, investing in automatic crash notification, strengthening pre-hospital care, enhance sharing of trauma and road safety data. So also getting back to what Rolf mentioned about ER data as well. There's a lot more details in there. There's just some of the highlights. There's also a new NCHRP guide on strategies to improve pedestrian safety at night. And I know I have an image here of lighting, but it's not all about lighting. It also talks about, safe roadway users strategies about vehicles, strategies for post-crash care. And I just wanted to highlight that 62% of fatal and serious injury pedestrian crashes occur at night or dawn or dusk periods. And then because we talked about roundabouts at our last meeting, wanted to highlight, and questions came up about pedestrian safety. I wanted to highlight this new research study that came out. It was a study of studies, so it wasn't actively contributing new data and findings, is more compiling research. And unfortunately, it mostly said further research should be conducted. So I think it's a little bit of an outstanding question, but it did highlight some areas of consensus about, disabled road users tend to prefer routes without roundabouts. And it can be challenging for particularly elderly and disabled individuals. So I think just something to keep in mind when you are considering a roundabout, if there's a senior housing facility nearby, it may or may not be the best treatment, for example. Okay, I know I went through that fast, so we'll be sending out the presentation if you wanted to dive into this more, but our next meeting is December 9th. Please join us. We will be continuing our discussion about the minor update and other fun presentations. All right, thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.
All right, thanks everybody. Take care.